we're going to start this lunchtime event. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and welcome to Sheffield. If you're new to Sheffield, welcome to the Wave. If you haven't been here before, welcome to the Urban Institute, welcome to Sheffield Urbanism. You're very welcome, as you can tell. I'm Beth Perry, I'm the Director of the Urban Institute, and this is our second public-facing event as part of the Sheffield Urbanism Winter Programme. It's a lunchtime dialogue in which we're going to have an insider view of the process of international urban policy making and the role of academics in shaping it, some of the insider knowledge on the process and how that works, what some of the strengths and limitations are to how we as academics and practitioners might engage in shaping these international debates. We're going to be using the example of the World Cities Report, which came out last year in 2024, which is a pretty weighty tome of 373 pages. So if you haven't all read it, never fear, because you have your experts here to talk about it. The World Cities Report was brought out by the UN Human Settlements Programme, UN Habitat, and it really provides a kind of comprehensive overview of what needs to be done at different scales in order to achieve the kinds of changes that we need to address climate change. So we are featuring two of the external authors on the report today who contributed. Dr. David Dogman, who's a visiting fellow at the Urban Institute this year, and is also General Director of the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. Welcome, David. We also have the other external author, Vanessa Castan-Broto, who's a professor of climate urbanism here at the Urban Institute. She's been leading our whole programme of work over many years on low carbon action in ordinary cities, community energy systems and projects in East Africa and around the world, and is just starting a new, very exciting programme of work on gender equality and inclusion in the just transition. They're going to be in dialogue with two of our colleagues here at Sheffield. Professor Andy Hindmore is a professor of politics and the coordinator of the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute. He's very widely published, including a book called Haywire, A Political History of Britain Since 2000, which was published by Penguin last year and will be out in hardback in May this year, with an update based on the general election, as I understand it. And Professor Liz Sharp, who's an environmental social scientist in the School of Geography and Planning and a UI associate. Liz's work focuses on local water systems in urban and industrialised countries, examining the often under-considered potential for more community involvement in shaping urban water infrastructure on the ground. So the format today is that Vanessa and then David are going to briefly say something about their involvement in the World Cities Report, what their hopes and expectations were setting off on this process, and then Andy and Liz are going to engage them in sets of debates and conversations to pull out some of those critical themes around political economy and internationally shaping urban agenda work. So over to you, Vanessa.
Well, thank you. So yeah, it is lovely to be able to present this report, which I actually have here in my hands for the first time because I had only seen it online. But David went to the World Urban Forum in Cairo in November, where it was launched, and brought with him some copies of it, and it's all available online. And also brought this cute little leaflet that gives you everything you need to know, and you can read it like in 2 minutes. So really exciting. And really, this is the flagship report of the UN Habitat, which is the United Nations agenda agency, that is in charge of human settlements, and that has really spearheaded a lot of thinking about what should be an agenda that is people-centered. And that has been for several years, and now they've brought this to look at climate change. And in terms of my role on it, we participate as external authors, so you could also think about it as consultants. So this is a report that doesn't belong to us in the same way as academic work belongs to us. So we we don't know the copyright, right? And we don't have a lot of authority in what goes in the end in the report. But you can provide enough information that informs the report and helps to build a vocabulary. And while doing that, you have the opportunity to actually reach audiences that otherwise we wouldn't be able to reach just with academic work. So for me, when the people at UN Habitat told me about their interest in doing something on cities and climate change, I immediately said, I'd like to be involved, because particularly because of my previous experience working with them in other similar reports. And they have this idea that they reach policymakers and they reach local governments. And after participating in those reports, often I went to do field work or to conferences and met maybe somebody who was working in a municipality and somebody who was, and they told me, oh, I read that report and I read such concept, I read such thing. And then you realize that this kind of report has a lot of influence in the way people think about things. And for an academic, I mean, as academic, we often feel so powerless, like we have to be here, but in fact, we are really powerful. We are really powerful because we are producing all that language that then enable to move into some sort of action somewhere. So that was my motivation. David?
You'll find it hard to believe looking at our youthful faces, but one of the first times Vanessa and I worked together was in 2010 on a similar UN Habitat report, the Global Report on Human Settlement. So for 15 years, we've been having some kind of work together on this. And it's been very interesting because my work has been in and out of universities, but has mainly been in the think tank and policy research space, where we have a different set of motivators for how we engage with different audiences, very often driven by the idea of beginning to think with the messages and what we would like different audiences to do differently with those messages. And I think that we get different kinds of influence through writing and engaging in different spaces, and the reports which are badged and legitimized by UN agencies do carry a particular weight in particular kinds of spaces, and I think that's really been one of my motivations for involved in different sorts of global reports, which we can maybe talk a bit about later. Particularly with city and local governments, there really is limited ways in which there is any sort of global legal framework to shape action. I mean, there are established frameworks of international law and conventions that bind national governments, although whether they choose to withdraw from those agreements is another matter, which I think we'll come to later. But with local and city governments, there's a lot to be done through convincing, cajoling, encouraging. And I think that's why, particularly these kinds of outputs as well can work very effectively in that space. And just one other motivation, it's a phenomenal opportunity to work with different people, to work with academics and authors from really all over the world. And I mean, that's one of the joys of a UN-led process, that the concerns of representativeness and diversity in authors and views are represented, and doing that in a structured way, and being, I believe most of us will have a commitment to having our assumptions challenged, but to actually have that done in a structured way as part of the process is a very, very good motivation as well.
Okay, great. I'm looking at this to see which one of us should ask the question first. That's the first question. Okay, so here's a nice starter, which is just talk us through a little bit more about the process and what it entailed. How often you were meeting face to face? How much of the time was online? How much of it was just doing solo work? Who edited and who you accountable? Just give us an overview of the process, and then maybe in that context, what you found most impressive about the process, and maybe with the benefit of hindsight, you look back and found quite challenging or felt didn't quite work.
So this is a very interesting process, because it's how do you do what people call peer review when your audience is policymakers? So a peer review that is kind of geared towards a different audience that we understand, and perhaps our more conventional academic ways of doing that peer review don't work exactly the same. So what we do, what UN Habitat does is like they organize an external board of academics from all around the world, and they take good care of representing all nations, and I think there's variation on who can be on the board depending on who is represented. And UN Habitat provides an initial outline of a wish list of what they would like, and then they commission a series of authors who prepare an initial draft, and then we meet for the first meeting and get all this live feedback. So this is really interesting because it's not like you get a feedback from somebody and then you have to respond to it, but what you get is a whole discussion. So there's the board, I don't remember now how many people it is, maybe 12, is small enough that sustained discussion can happen. So we have the meeting over 2 or 3 days, and the discussions are quite in depth and go into the examples of each example almost is discussed, each kind of fact numbers, and that in a way that everybody can provide a contrasting perspective. I find that really useful. And also this idea that, for example, if you are coming with examples always from the same region, then the board are able to provide you other examples of regions that are underrepresented. And then we produced the initial drafts, the initial kind of outlines of presentations are totally revised into a final draft. And that final draft is again revised in another meeting. So it's 2 meetings where the whole board and all the authors come together for a few days and they discuss the detail of the report. But eventually after that, you submit your final version. UN Habitat has their own collaborative authors, so it's also a bit collaborative with people in UN Habitat who then take those drafts and adapt them to also the kind of priorities, the policy priorities that they are seeing, and also they had a bit of an editor, external editors that revise for language, for like giving it a more journalistic style. And that goes into the report. And of that final version that's where we lose control of the content. And perhaps that's the moment where the process becomes a little bit frustrated for us academics, which we are very used to have a say in the last comma of our paper.
Liz, you want to come in there?
Yeah, no, I was interested. So, I understand this thing about drawing on people from different places and stuff, but do they pay you for it? Are you expected to give it as part of your job? Is your university expected to give the time? I mean, how is this resourced?
Yeah. You want to go?
No.
They do pay you.
They do. Okay, that's good. Yeah, but I mean, not so much
As
you.
a consultant.
Yeah.
So you are
But
a
it's
consultant.
important that somebody from Kenya who's giving their time on this actually gets
Yeah.
rewarded. It's really crucial.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say they pay you a lot, but they do pay you something that makes it worth it for anybody of any part of the world to do it.
Okay, and that would be more money in Kenya than it would be here, presumably, or wherever. So,
We don't have it.
and not,
We
I
don't
don't
know that.
mean,
That's
I mean,
not-
it just, buying power or whatever.
Yeah. I understand that everybody in the report gets paid for it because also the content is owned by UN Habitat.
Yes, I mean, I suppose my question was really, do they feel like they're being asked to give it as a present? But it sounds like no, there is some compensation. Okay, so
And in that sense, I would say my work with UN Habitat I've always found them really fair
Okay,
in
excellent.
understanding arguments that we've been making within post-colonial studies or arguments about the colonization of knowledge that I've been, since we first worked with UN Habitat then it was called the Global Report on Human Settlements on Cities and Climate Change, which at the time was much more focused on mitigation than this one because of the different debates that were taken at the time. At the time, I already found it really refreshing on the way they were approached.
Okay.
But I mean, I don't know all the
So I'd now
politics
like
of it.
to move on to the question of audience.
Yeah.
So an earlier UN Habitat report has a definition of planning as something like planning is, shaping space around us in urban areas or something like that, which we as a department took up as this is our definition of what planning is, because we don't want to see planning just as sitting in a land use planning office. So, there's one perhaps not expected audience for a report, but I guess for this report, who do you see as the audience? As you've talked a little bit about that already, and how do you expect them to use it? What difference do you expect this to make? What impact? And maybe David first, just.
Yeah. There are multiple audiences, and as I said, I mean the level of direct influence that you can exert on any one of them, and particularly on local governments, is limited. So your audience is influenced by the strength and quality of your argument. First and foremost for this, it is subnational and local governments. There is a sense within the UN system broadly that even in the space of development or the environment, that the UN Development Programme or UN Environment lead the engagement and lead with member states as a key constituency. Whereas within the UN system, UN Habitat is the mandate to speak to subnational and local governments. And so very much the focus and the intended audience to think of in the first instance is people in those positions. Not expecting mayors to read this, but hoping that they will pick up this, and with the expectation that city officials with responsibilities for particular portfolios will delve into different sections of it. I guess I suppose as I have written for this and for other international reports, there's always been a tension between a perceived demand to be advised on how to do something. So the chapter in there that I had most to do with is on infrastructure. And there is a sense that what is needed is an answer to the question, how do we make our infrastructure more resilient? Or how do we have a lower carbon infrastructure in cities? And I'm not at all qualified really to give advice on that. And I don't think a 40-page chapter is going to be much use on doing so either. My starting point is a lot more, how do we think differently about infrastructure? How do we ask the right questions about infrastructure for whom, decisions about infrastructure by whom, where to get appropriate ideas and have to apply them to different kinds of infrastructure. And so there can be a tension between those two sets of expectations, and we maybe we sometimes meet somewhere in the middle.
In terms of audience, so for me, sometimes it's a little bit frustrating that we have to think about we are writing for policy makers, but the policymaker, who is the policymaker? There is not really a policymaker, and it becomes a little bit confusing who the audience is. It's like when you see, I don't know, in a review of a book, oh, this book will be of interest for all academics. Yeah, of course, but like, I mean, we are such a heterogeneous bunch. Like, how do you identify the interests and the ways you can reach? And I think, in fact, the audience is a lot broader. Mm-hmm. And one example is that I also participated in some of the previous reports, World Cities report on the future of sustainable urbanization, and we wrote this piece about the kind of challenges of implementing nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions now are a little bit fashionable, let's say, and a lot of people are thinking about that as a way to respond to climate change. Of course, it is proven to work. It also has some disadvantages. And we wrote a little piece about that. And then I went to a meeting in Barcelona with some officials there. And when we were talking about it, it was really clear that they were interested in that conversation. And then we could perhaps explore the conversation and maybe show the diagram or have a bit of talk around that, And so I think it gives you a lot of opportunities to talk with different people, not just with the mayor, but with all the people who work in the municipality, with some NGOs that are collaborating in local policy, with community-based organizations, with business, because
How
you
does
show
it-
this to business and they may be engaging in ideas that otherwise they wouldn't consider.
So, because those audiences look at it, how does that cause it to make a difference? Do you think it impacts, do you think they think, oh, this is a good idea, we'll do this now? Or do you think it's more that the UN Habitat stamp of approval gives it a legitimacy them to push forward on things they already want to do? You know, what's the sort of mechanism of change that you're envisaging?
This is going to be an eternal discussion about what is impact, and the problem is that we are always like trying to see like this neat relationship between this is the piece of knowledge I produce, this is the impact it causes. And I'm sorry to say that despite what we may think for the rest, is perhaps not the most realistic way of thinking about impact. I actually think how we create impact is by creating new ways of thinking about things, and tracing the influence of that is incredibly difficult, and also it will require us to make statements about ourselves that wouldn't be fair, you know, about, oh, I'm the person who put this concept on the table. No, we have all put that concept on the table. So perhaps trying to build that argument is always a bit tricky. But myself, I like to think that creating the discussion first with for example, just the group that we did the report, the advisory board, we are all people who talk with a lot of people, have networks, some more networks. So just the fact that we discussed and refine our ideas, that has already created a lot of impact. And then when the report comes out, you hope that some people will create conversations around it. And what those conversations will be, is absolutely outside of my hands. I mean, maybe they say that's just not very interesting, and that's okay, because maybe that enables them to put aside some ideas that are in the report that they don't like.
So you look back on the process, it's obviously an academic one, you're contributing academic knowledge and you're working with other academics. Did it also feel at the time like a very political process in which you are either trying to anticipate what it is that you could or couldn't say, or what kinds of things your audience and the policymakers might be most receptive to? Are you aware of interests lurking outside of the room that you need to be aware of? So as academics, we normally don't have to think about those things. This instance, I'm curious to know to what extent it felt all along as a political exercise. That's not necessarily at the expense of your academic knowledge, but how they sit together.
I mean, it's not a bad thing to be reminded that it's political, because all of our knowledge production is political. And I mean, if we sort of hide behind thinking that we are objective and rational, then we're kidding ourselves. I mean, a bit of reminder that we're engaged in a process where there are inherent power relations and politics is not a bad thing. It's less political than some other global processes. Vanessa and I have also been very involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and where there is a formal intergovernmental approval process for the text before it is released into the world. And this is less political than that. Although, of course, there is an eye on the anything which is seen to represent the world that comes from a UN agency has to be managed quite carefully. Many of the things where we've been encouraged to consider were perhaps influenced by political, that had an element of political influence. Many of them were good. I mean, they are global agendas which we were encouraged to incorporate. Encouraged by UN Habitat to incorporate, because these are priorities for them as an international agency. So, as a specific example in this report, in the last 3 or 4 years, UN Habitat has become very aware of issues of disability within cities. And as recognise that over time it has been blind to this as a particular issue, as a particular issue of inclusion, as a particular issue of urban design. And so where we may not have initially considered that when writing about, we should have considered it when writing about infrastructure, but because of processes going outside, it was very much pushed to say this is something that you need to involve. Vanessa may have a different take on the politics as well.
No, I think politics is what politics is influence, right? Well, power is influence, and we are influencing each other in every stage of our lives. So I think politics permeates everything. There are some processes that may have a more strong character of political with a big P. I think as academics, we have to bring our biases. We have to think that we are approaching everything from a normative point of view, and think a little bit of what consequences would it have to propose something in your report. So for example, if somebody comes and tells me, I have a super great example of artificial intelligence that's going to save the world, and you want to put it in the report, you have to think about the wording of that and the consequences that's going to have when somebody reads it. That doesn't mean that anybody influences me what I think those consequences are going to have. But I do think everything we write, particularly in a place like this that can be read by broader audiences over which we have no control, will have a political influence, and therefore we have to consider.
May I ask a follow-up question to that? I think it's quite interesting then. I agree with you. I think we do need to acknowledge our biases and kind of own where we're coming from. But when you're playing into a policy processes frequently need to present something as an objective fact, an outcome of, all the experts agree that, this is to assert things without, this is my view from this position, hanging on it. So how do you deal with that contradiction?
So I would think these are very difficult questions which our whole society is grappling with. And if you think I have the solution to this, you are kidding yourself. But I see expertise as something that emerges through exchange and negotiation. And that whereas philosophically the absolute knowledge about the world is perhaps inaccessible, we can get with plausible narratives around the world that are the product of agreement. And if you have that discussion, like maybe some other international reports may have been done in the late 1990s by a bunch of middle-class white male of Anglophone extraction in some basement somewhere doing a report, probably that would be a bit less interesting and a bit less reliable and a bit less reflective of actual experiences of the city than a report that is done by a wide range of people who disagree about many things and who come from different backgrounds, who have had a range of experiences, and who through debate may come to the core of what they think is interesting. And they don't try to kind of sell you something or give you a ready-made solution, but they try to show you ways of thinking that may help you reach your own conclusion. And that's where the truth lies. And that's why expertise becomes really important.
Okay. Thank you.
Tone's an interesting one because the report, in writing the report as well, you've got to balance a presentation of the acute challenges the world faces and the scale of the urgency without the text ever appearing despairing. And I mean, that's often the case with climate debates, but I noticed reading this report that you kind of constantly felt walking between that little bit of the tightrope there. Did that tone get added afterwards? How did you balance that one in terms of your own writing and the way you approached it, David?
It's been difficult to manage in any writing about climate change and climate action, because on the one hand, the narrative is terrible. I mean, I showed the slide here a couple of days ago about the gap between commitments and the necessary actions to to keep 1.5 degrees alive. And it is a terrifying narrative. Well, a terrifying fact. I mean, this is indisputable science about how short we're falling in the necessary actions, and how dreadful the consequences will be if we continue to fall short. When you think though about the audience. We can't afford to have them just throw their hands up in despair and say, well, it's all terrible and there's nothing we can do there. There needs to be a belief that something can be done, something must be done, but that something can be done as well. I think as when I'm writing it, and I think for many of the authors, there is an awareness from the beginning that we somehow need to do this without sort of glib platitudes that we can, we avoid terrible things like win-win or triple wins when we're writing, but trying to be both motivating whilst aware of the scale of the challenge. I don't think too much of it has been put in afterwards. I feel we had a shared sense that it was something we needed to try and do.
I think when we talk, so I was laughing, but I was laughing like when you have nervous laugh because it's a bit of a sensitive issue. But it is really, the question is really important. But I think one problem is that when we think about climate change, we tend to adopt like this kind of sense of heroic narrative of response is this evil thing that's going to come to us, climate change. And I almost imagine like some aliens landing on land. And then we are going to come together with this heroic solution led by somebody. And I think it's a very useless narrative, that it confuses us in our thinking, and it confuses us on how things actually happen in the world. The other challenge that we have is one of our problems of governance is that we feel that we can only act on things, we can measure them at a certain level, and the way we measure things doesn't always reflect the way we act on things. There's a kind of a massive gap between practice and acting, and between the narratives that we make to evaluate that acting, let's say, the evaluation gap. And we see, for example, in terms of decarbonization, we tend to measure that with a single measure, which is emissions reductions. But emission reductions doesn't always tackle the actual important emissions or the actual important things. I cannot go into that detail. Perhaps I will get a bit confused if I do. But it's one example of measures that don't really accurately tell us how to move into action. So when I write a report like this, and actually I think those were the instructions we got from UN Habitat, it's like we have to focus on action, we have to focus on what can be done, we have to focus on practice, what is being done already. And when you look at what is being done already, what people are doing around the world, it's actually much more hopeful, because there's so much that people want to do. There's so many people taking responsibility every day and incorporating all kinds of interesting things in their lives without necessarily having to be, I don't know, kind of set hurt into some course of action. So I feel somehow when I look at people in their environments, living their lives and constructing, I don't know, a new garden, a new kind of urban farm or something like that, I feel really hopeful. Or we were talking before about the mangroves restoration in the Philippines. The problem is that it's so little. People find so many obstacles to actually do that. Yeah, I think probably that's what you need. You need and that's perhaps what a report like this and perhaps the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change could do, which, by the way, they are doing another report on cities and climate change now, is to think, how can we build the architecture for all these initiatives that are already taking place everywhere, for all this local innovation and place-based action to actually make a difference? So do we need measurement infrastructure? We need financial infrastructure? We need institutional infrastructure? What is it that we need?
Yeah, so picking up on that a little bit, this issue of the local and the neighbourhood and or individual, if you want, that set of actions versus, or it's not versus, but, you know, as well as the city. So this report is, you know, focused on the cities and that sort of the primary audiences and so on, who have underneath them, so to speak, all of these different communities. But just as there's a conflict between the nation state and the cities about resources and power, in the same way there's something of a conflict between city authorities and local communities on resources and power. And I suppose I'm interested in how you negotiate that one and how what were their tensions along those lines? I mean, one senses that the international narrative, as like what you've just said, Vanessa, is moving towards the neighbourhoods and the local. But sometimes that's just a cop-out for people not to bother doing things, say, oh, it's all the public's responsibility.
Mhm.
So, you know, how do you manage it without dumping it on communities?
Yeah, I think part of it is by being aware of different audiences and different spaces for engagement. So in many settings, I am trying to do it with a degree of integrity as well, and that's perhaps the most challenging part. I find myself in many settings where local governments, mayors, city actors are ignored, disparaged, seen as lacking capacity, seen as not being significant actors. And in those spaces, I champion them. There is at least a partially true narrative that greater subsidiarity, decentralization, facilitation of local governments, transfer of resources can be a fundamental way of having cities which work better for their residents. I also find myself frequently in spaces where local governments are actively disempowering to their most marginalized and lowest income communities, where local governments are at the forefront of evictions, are prioritizing the interests of commercial and wealthy actors rather than of the poorer people within their cities. And in those places, I find myself being a huge critic of local governments and mayors and challenging them to think in different ways. So, I mean, it is hard to do this with integrity or with consistency, apart from recognizing that there are different forms of embeddedness and different forms of relationship, and that in different configurations, actors are more or less powerful in relation to the other actors that they engage with. In the same way, I think one of the things I find difficult in writing these things is how you champion individual cases where there is a need to have a positive narrative and to say, look, this city has done amazing things and we should learn from it and engage with it, whilst knowing full well that because I've been in a position to engage in the real fine details of it and have seen where it doesn't work as well, really having to speak through gritted teeth as putting forward something as a fantastic example, whereas knowing that at certain levels, when you dig into the detail, it's a lot more problematic. So those are some sort of personal contradictions in working in multiple spaces simultaneously, and having to fight slightly different battles depending on where you are and what you're trying to accomplish in that space.
Liz, could I just jump in there, Vanessa, it's okay, ask a bit of a follow-on for David, which is one of the things I hadn't really stopped to think about, which is pretty ignorant of me, is when you talk about city space, how much of that city space is irregular space, as it gets called in the report, in which the governance structures are at a starting point going to be relatively weak. And I was reading in particular the infrastructure chapter that you'd be most closely involved in, and trying to imagine the tensions of the recommendations you make when you've got city spaces that on the one hand are highly governed, they're multi-level governed and it's complicated, but at the same time they're irregularly governed insofar as they're governed at all. And that adds a whole new level of complexity and difficulty to that process of making those recommendations.
And it's a challenge for cities way beyond just in response to climate change. I mean, it's a challenge around providing basic services, providing shelter, providing education, healthcare, providing a revenue base from taxation for cities to actually be able to do things. I mean, where I think we come to, and which fits more generally with things I've been interested in, is seeing how structures of governance do actually exist. And there are models of there are means of organisation, and there are means of getting things done. They are necessarily born out of crisis and born out of a deficit. But things get done even where the formal structures of government lack the capacity to do things. I think the worthwhile point is that these shouldn't be ignored and overwritten by new formal structures, but they can be worked with by the more formal, by more formal government actors. That's something that Vanessa's worked on a lot as well.
Yeah, so I had to follow up.
I know.
I was just thinking about, with your questions, about the power of contestation, really, and the power of conflict, and whether that's something that is a negative or it's actually a real positive that creates change, and that sometimes is perhaps what makes a city more resilient and a better place to live. And on the one hand, I was thinking about how very localized social movements have been able to lobby local governments into providing land, providing housing, building resilience, reducing vulnerability, and through conflict. I'm thinking, for example, of the communities in the slopes around the city of Lima, for example, and how they have really fought, not always that successful, but other times perhaps a bit more, for their rights, and often accompanied by a host of intermediary organizations, NGOs particularly, sometimes with a foot at the university and so on. So those are really interesting examples where that conflict may create very important changes in governance. But sometimes those conflicts, they are a bit less visible. And if you read the report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, particularly Working Group 3 there, who also have a chapter on cities, which is the group on mitigation, one of the main insights is that the form of institutional governance that has really made a difference to climate action in cities over the last 20 years has been the creation of city networks. Why? Because city networks have capitalized in that conflict that you were talking about, Liz, between the local government and the national government, and have been able to build a whole research and action agenda around that. And again, through my teeth, because they are not perfect, and there's been so much critical studies of them, but they've done a journey from the initial networks like the Governance for Local Sustainability, ICLEI, but later the C40, often they were fighting for autonomy, fighting for local governments having some more capacity to act, and then they have seamlessly moved into a more pragmatic, consensual approach in which the last decade has been focused on actually providing precise alternatives and demonstrating the performance of alternatives and kind of create aggregates, for example, of carbon emission reductions at the global level and so on. So the role may be ambiguous, but often emerges from those kind of conflicts or crises that lead to that form of institutional innovation.
And in a way, maybe there's potential for neighborhoods or like the parts of towns to also network and, you know, to do something of that scalar conflict and say, look, as a neighborhood, if you give us more resources, we can achieve more. Look how much we've achieved already. And to network with other neighborhoods. I don't know. I mean, they haven't got elected officials or the number of people in the same way. But But I think it's interesting to think about how that more ground level
Yeah. So
activity can make a difference.
the creation of solidarity networks, I think, has been one of the most important strategies for people living in informal settlements. And Islam Shack Dwellers International has been one of the organizations that has capitalized on that. Perhaps I would say make a difference to a lot of communities. So do I go with the example? In the Philippines, we work with the Homeless People's Federation of the Philippines, which is an affiliate of Islam Dwellers International, and works directly with the community. Is formed by the communities themselves. The communities themselves that have come into a national level federation. They have a network of organizations that support them with knowledge and with technical assistance, but they really try to respond to the needs of informal settlements. And I find that really inspiring. And what I don't find inspiring is that these people do not often find the funding they need.
Can I pick up on one of Vanessa's points just before about the city networks? Because I think that's an important audience for this kind of report as well. And she mentioned C40, which began as C20, 20 of the world's leading cities. Ken Livingstone and Mike Bloomberg really at the forefront, a message that seems to fit the Londons and the Singapores and the New Yorks of this world. And over the period of their existence, both the focus of what they have done and the cities that they have focused on, I think it would be fair to say has been influenced by the positive critical engagement of academics and by the positive critical input from these kinds of reports. They are a much different sort of network than they were originally. And that's been because of, I think, constructive critique and dialogue. And sometimes these reports facilitate that.
Can I ask a question about the sort of hidden conflicts? So you mentioned some conflicts are more visible than others. And I was thinking about the conflict that's come up in some of my students' work between basically lots of people digging, middle-class people having boreholes that extract groundwater, leaving groundwater resources at great risk across cities, and indeed water resources across whole swathes of countries. So how do we, this is individual action driven really by the fact that the municipal provision isn't there, or is poor, but effectively working against collective well-being in a huge way that is going to suddenly hit. How do we protect against that, or is this dealt with in the report?
I'm not sure that we dealt with it in the report. No. I'm not sure what to respond other than that it's a really valid point, and I mean we see it in a range of things, from water, sanitation, but energy. Private generation, but also in securitization. The failure, the inability of the state to provide security for citizens, and so people buying that in, and whether it's through gating or through private security. And there are just so many ways where when the municipal provision isn't there, the individualized responses worsen. Solving or at least ameliorating the situation for some people worsens the situation overall.
So at the Urban Institute, this has been a core for the 10 years of the Urban Institute. This has been a core question. Because many of us have grown up in our academic careers engaged with debates about infrastructure and how infrastructure gets fragmented through splintering urbanism. That was the original thesis by Simon Marvin and Steve Graham. And this is really a dynamic that we see not just in water, but in almost any service that you can imagine. Sorry, my mind was going into other kind of examples. But I think it's interesting that what happens, very simplified, because this you can only talk about it from a very simplified perspective. But imagine an ideal city, and then you get to have a process of spatial differentiation. Then you start to have different forms of vulnerability coming through the city, and that leads to that infrastructure fragmentation, where there is a service fragmentation, where some people get more vulnerable, while other people get more protected and safer. eventually that people that is more protected and safer are going to find themselves also being vulnerable because of the way services degenerate for the whole city, the way the sense of collective provision degenerates, the sense of the kind of urban solidarity degenerates. So if we are going to think, I don't know, about the urban revolution, the spirit of Henry Lefebvre or something, maybe that's going to be one that brings some solidarity with it. And that brings some kind of thinking of those flooding, water, electricity, waste management, they all require that.
Yes.
They all require coming together and thinking about collectively what it's going to mean. So one of the things we say in the report is we should be talking about negotiated resilience. And negotiated resilience may take different forms, but for example, in Belo Horizonte, where we've been working with Viego, which is the organization that helps people working in informal work, and this is something that Viego has proposed. They've created these platforms that enable people in the city to negotiate with the waste pickers, who normally would be totally ignored because their knowledge wouldn't be valued in the governance structures of the city. And the latest plan of the state has actually recognized those platforms as the possibility of that negotiation. And I hear that, again, it's not all perfect. But remember, we are not looking for perfection. We are looking for action and movement and the possibility to address future challenges.
I'm conscious we've got about
We are,
8 minutes left.
A
So
little bit less. Oh, about 8 minutes, you're right.
So where is the question about Donald Trump? Come on.
Too soon to tell. But it is what next, I guess, is the question, both in terms of your own involvement in this process, what you think the immediate international environment looks like. And David, you're here for a while, so also just kind of what work you're doing whilst you're here. I'm interested to learn a little bit more about as well.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that that's easier, but it's really nice that I work in an institute which has a focus on housing and urban development, and but with a different sort of focus and mandate to the Urban Institute here. So just the exchange between those two settings is just really interesting and useful, and we'll see where that takes us in the coming months. I mean, there's sort of waves and cycles of interest in the international agenda on cities. In 1976, there was the first Global World Habitat Conference that really brought a lot of interest and attention to cities from around the world together, and that's been repeated at 20-year intervals. And so, I mean, a bunch of us from here were in Quito in 2016, the launch of a new urban agenda, which I can't resist saying is a bit like the Holy Roman Empire. It was neither new nor urban nor very much of an agenda. But then, I suppose, a lot more seriously, the recognition in the global climate policy space that cities really do matter. And in the period that the IPCC has been producing reports, going from a very much natural science, ecosystem and atmospheric science-based approach to a starting work now on an IPCC special report on climate change and cities, which will come out in 2027. And this really is a very, very big change, because then the IPCC's purpose is to inform the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is member state led. And for the Framework Convention to be forced to see cities as being fundamentally at risk from climate change and a fundamental part of the response, not just as implementers, but as shaping strategy response, really is significant. I guess the other thing, which is in a much more embryonic stage, is the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda. At the start of a new year, it's always very alarming to realize what year you're in. It's not that long until 2030. The SDG 11 has been on safe, inclusive, resilient and sustainable cities. And what's going to replace that as a motivating force for cities in a global, either a global development or an international development agenda will be another area for the next few years for us to see.
So just as a final question then, in the context of the rise of the right across the globe, Vanessa, what does the city's agenda have to help challenge I presume challenge and push forward a more progressive approach?
I like to think it's maybe not a city's agenda, but a habitation agenda.
Okay.
So how do we live in the world? And as David was talking, I was remembering, so a couple of years ago, we held at the Urban Institute a conference that was called Urban Habitation in the Anthropocene. And if you were not there, it was wonderful because we had people from the humanities, social sciences, natural sciences. It was just very nice. But maybe one of the nicest things of the conference was how it concluded with a keynote from our colleague Linda Westman. She gave us a lecture about the notion of the impasse. She argued that we were in a moment of impasse. And I think she really foretold the moment we are living now. I mean, now when I'm thinking, we are in this moment in which we've done so much progress in rights. Like for me, for example, how the rise of the LGBTIQ plus movement have changed through my lifetime, and therefore how they have changed my life and the way I think about the world. And also the progress, which I still think is modest, but on gender equality and feminist values, the progress in ecologism. I mean, when I study environmental sciences at the university, I mean, the thinking was so much more technocratic than now. Ideas of participation were really marginal. So all those histories of knowledge and thinking, they've kind of come to a moment in which they're provoking a reaction. And I think we are all a little bit confused about where are we going and in what direction. And I think that confusion is bringing the extreme right. Why? Because the extreme right obviously offers you a way out. But I think, yeah, obviously I don't have to say that it's a very poor way of thinking, but I think it's a reaction to the current moment. It's a reaction to the kind of processes that we've been living through.
So we could see it as an unfortunate side effect of our success.
As a symptom, but I wouldn't call it success. But what I would say is that perhaps, like when I look at my daughter, I mean, it's a commonplace, but when I look at my daughter and our students and that, I see very different ways of thinking that really fill me with, I wouldn't call it hope. But I always like to say Mac Davis, think with hope, think without hope. No, act with hope, act without hope, but act. but I do think, when I look at the students and when I look at younger people, it gives me pleasure. So I hope other people get that pleasure as well.
A very nice positive note to finish on, probably.
A lot of focus on the youth as well.
Yeah.
I think confusion and hope go together, don't they? Thank you very much, all four of you, for contribution to the dialogue. We've recorded it so people will be able to listen again. David, you're going to be backwards and forwards, hopefully, over the course of the year, so there'll be plenty of time for us to continue these kinds of conversations. So, yeah, please just join me in thanking all of you for participating in the dialogue today.
Thank you.